Hello, this is Rob Kennison. Today we're going to talk about the introductory material to our class on psychology and age. Please read chapter 1 of Hoyer to give you that our text's version of the information that I'm going to give you. Um, in class, we will do this icebreaker, but I would like you to think a little bit about the following three questions. What do you fear about growing old? What do you look forward to about being older? And finally, describe an older adult who has impacted your life. Moving on to today's material, um, I want to begin by answering a pretty basic question. Why study aging? And I'm going to provide you four reasons today to why I think the study of aging is important. Your text actually provides different reasons, so please read the text and understand the reasons that it provides. You may also have your own reasons for taking this class, perhaps reasons that go beyond simply fulfilling a requirement. So why study aging? Again, I'm going to give you four reasons to why I think the study of aging is important. And the first of those reasons is that people are living longer. And this is an incredible change over the last 116, 20 years. Since around the turn of the 20th century, that is in 1900, the lifespan has nearly doubled. That is, life expectancy in 1900 was about 40. And today, it is nearly 79. So we have seen a near doubling of the lifespan over just over 100-year period. That is an absolutely incredible achievement. And in addition, the frequency of those reaching 100, that is, becoming centenarians, has also increased. That is, the people who are living into very old age, the number of those people has increased dramatically. It used to be almost unheard of for a person to live to be 100. Nowadays, it's not that uncommon, and it's becoming more common with each passing decade. And finally, in this idea that we're living longer, uh, we are inching closer to our maximum potential lifespan, which is considered to be approximately 130 years. Has anybody lived to be 130? Not that we know of. But it is believed that the human body has the potential to stay alive and be in relatively good shape up to about 130 years. We are slowly heading in that direction. We obviously have a long way to go. In this graph, you can see that life expectancy, in this case from 1970 to 2010, has increased dramatically. In 1970, life expectancy was about 71 years, and in 2010, it was around 78 years. So when a person is born nowadays, a person can expect to live to be about 78 years on average. If you go back to 1970, 40 years before, that was considerably shorter. So this brings up the question, why are people living longer? And it's a fairly complex question, but some of the major changes over the last 120 years that have provided this extension of the lifespan include improvements in hygiene and sanitation. And this has been tremendous. If you were to go to, let's say, London around the late 1800s, during the Industrial Revolution, when London was actually the hub of modernization, what you would experience to be there is horrible. The smog was awful, the smoke, the sanitation, there was sewage running in the streets. It was just a god-awful environment. And over the last 100 years or so, we have really worked to clean up our living environments and also clean ourselves up. We take much better care of ourselves in terms of personal hygiene. The second wave that led to the extension of the lifespan is disease control. That is, preventing death from diseases that could occur at any point in the lifespan. Perhaps the most notable disease control medication was the discovery of antibiotics, essentially drugs that kill bacteria. And bacterial infections was really the leading cause of death up into the early 19th or 20th century. Other medical advances have allowed people to live longer, and today much of the extension to the lifespan that we see has to do with cardiovascular health and allowing people to live longer in old age. So we've found a lot of ways to help people live longer, healthier lives. And so over the last, say, 30 years, a lot of that has been helping older adults do better. The second reason to study aging is that we are currently experiencing the graying of America. And so at this point, the older adult population, that is, people age 65 and older, account for about 14% of the American population. But by 2030, that is in just around 10 years, we're going to see that percent go up to 20% of the population. That is a 6% increase over a decade. And essentially, this observation is known as the graying of America. And not only is America experiencing this, many countries are seeing this same phenomenon where they're going to experience population explosions of older adults. So you might ask why? Why are we going to see this population explosion of older adults? And much of this has to do with World War II and what happened after its conclusion. Essentially, we had this massive war. And during that period, many of our young males were soldiers fighting in either the European theater or in the Japanese theater. And after the war ended, all those people came back, and they were basically young adults. They came back en masse. They got married and had tons and tons of kids. And so essentially what this led to is what is known as the baby boom. So the baby boom occurred just after the end of World War II. It was really encapsulated the 1950s and 60s, and there was a massive explosion of infants, and those infants grew up and essentially became what we know today as the baby boom generation. And so we had this huge cohort of people, and that cohort has had children, and their children, by and large, are known as the millennial generation. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. Another thing that we see with the graying of America is that the oldest old, say age 80 plus, is the fastest growing segment of our population. We're seeing an even bigger population explosion if you look at the old. And of course, what this means is that a lot of resources are going to have to uh, be dedicated to caring for those people. So this essentially brings up the question, what do you believe are the important implications of this population explosion known as the graying of America? So again, we're going to see this population explosion of older adults, and this is known as the graying of America. Some of the implications of this are changes to entitlement programs. And so major entitlement programs that you're probably familiar with include Social Security and Medicare. Social Security is essentially a retirement benefit where a person who has earned Social Security gets a monthly income. I should say that the amount of money that a person is likely to get is not really enough to live on. In fact, it is simply a poverty level income. To give you an example, I'm anticipating monthly Social Security checks of about $1,500–$1,600 a month. And if you think that in today's economy I could live on that amount of money, that is almost impossible. But Social Security does provide a added supplement to help people in retirement. The other major entitlement program is Medicare. Medicare is essentially socialized medicine. It is a socialized system that provides medical care, both in terms of hospitalization and doctor coverage and prescription coverage, if you choose, to all older adults. Anybody living in this country who has citizenship is approved for Medicare. And so it is essentially a entitlement that we all can look forward to. Both of these programs are going to be challenged in terms of their funding. Both programs currently are funded with enough money to run each of the programs to fulfill their commitments. However, as we see the graying of America, this population explosion, both of these programs are eventually going to become insolvent, which essentially means that the amount of money that they receive through tax dollars is not going to allow the programs to fund the commitments that they have. And when and if that happens, that is going to be a dark day for our country. That said, the fix to both of these programs is really in the hands of Congress, and they need to eventually sit down and figure out how to fix these programs. This is likely to either involve increased taxes, reduction in benefits, both. There are other things that can be done around the margins to help the program survive, but they're going to have to be fixed. Sometimes I get the question, well, am I going to get Social Security? I don't think that's going to actually happen for me. And my answer at this point is I think you will. I think you will get both Social Security and Medicare, but the benefits may not be as generous as I anticipate getting. So it could be that benefits are reduced. A second implication of the graying of America is changed perceptions in aging and what we think of as old. You've probably heard the saying 60 is the new 50. And that really is true. If I look back and if I were to look at photographs of my relatives, let's say in their 60s, and then I were to compare those images to people in their 70s, they would probably look to be about the same age. We are doing aging better. And that means that perceptions about what is old are changing. One of the movers of the change in perceptions is an organization known as the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. This is the largest organization in the country. Its magazine has historically had the largest circulation of any magazine in the country. And they are a powerful organization. They have a lot of political influence. They have the ability to influence Congress. If you think of organizations that can influence Congress, you might think first and foremost of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which historically has had a tremendous amount of power, whether we like that or not. But the AARP, much more quietly, also wields an incredible amount of power. And they, if they don't like a policy, they are likely to influence Congress to not change a policy. So, like I said, they have incredible power. They also are working very hard to change our perceptions of what's old. And as the baby boomers age, we're seeing images of older adults who look fit, young, and healthy. And the AARP has been very much behind this kind of campaign. The third implication of the graying of America is changes to pop culture and marketing. When I was younger, when I was young, pop culture was very much fixed on youth, the youth culture. This would be in the 70s, and rock and roll was everything. And so marketing, the people that companies marketed to was very much a younger audience. And there wasn't a lot of variability. Nowadays, pop culture targets not just youth culture, but all ages and all groups in our age groups in our culture. And if you watch television these days and you watch TV commercials, say, for evening television, you're likely to see a predominance of commercials marketing to the baby boomers, and especially in the area of pharma. New drugs that are being marketed to older adults to help them with cholesterol, reduce blood pressure, aid a person's ability to sleep, and reduce erectile dysfunction. All of these are generally targeted towards middle and older adults. So we have seen a real change to pop culture over the last 2 or 3 decades. The third reason that I provide for why we want to study aging is that psychological processes are an important part of the human experience. And these processes change as we age. So, for example, memory and cognition, our ability to think, our ability to remember, our ability to reason, these abilities tend to decline as we grow older. And so we probably need to know about these changes and whether we can do something to help people overcome some of the age-related declines that people may experience in their thinking, in their ability to remember. Another psychological process is our emotional well-being, and this includes measures of life satisfaction and happiness. And these are important issues. We all want to be satisfied in our daily life. We want to be happy. And so the question is, how do these processes change as we move across the adult lifespan? Which, by the way, on a side note, if you look at life satisfaction, the effect that people tend to see is that when they're young, life satisfaction is pretty high. As they move into middle age, get married, and in particular have children, life satisfaction tends to drop somewhat. And essentially, this would be uh, middle age, where people are caring for their family, they're raising children. The responsibilities of life are not on themselves, but are taking care of others. And then those children get older, and they leave. That is, people find themselves with an empty nest, and it turns out that life satisfaction goes up again. So if we look at life satisfaction, what we see generally is that young, single, and recently married people tend to have pretty high life satisfaction. older adults who are their children are out of the home, and perhaps they're in the process of becoming grandparents, those kinds of things. Again, life satisfaction is pretty high. The responsibilities of middle adulthood tend to lower life satisfaction. So you might ask, well, does that mean that I shouldn't do those things? And of course, the answer is that's up to you. The rewards of parenthood, the rewards of marriage, can be tremendous. So I am by no means trying to discourage having children, but I think we should go informed. And what we tend to see is that life satisfaction drops a bit when we engage in raising a family. Third psychological process, one that we'll look at is mental health, such as depression rates and dementia. Dementia is a late life condition typically that causes cognitive impairment. Both of these are affected by age, depression, and dementia, and so we'll talk about those things. So those are some of the psychological processes that we will talk about, and another reason to think about age. Finally, in my list of reasons to study aging, the last one concerns you and me and all of us. You, your family, and friends will grow old. Your family and friends will grow old. If you are fortunate to live long enough, are likely to see your grandparents and your parents die during your lifetime. Those, by the way, are difficult times, and we'll talk about those times in this class. So death, as it turns out, is a part of life and is a part of life that we all are likely to encounter, obviously, in our own mortality, but also the loss of loved ones and of friends. And so aging is a part of life. And since it is something that we are all going to do, you're doing it now, but it's going to become different in meaning as you move into middle and older age. And this is a reason to take this class. So that is the last reason to study aging. So at this point, I've given you some reasons to study aging. And again, the text provides different reasons. You may have your own. I encourage you to think about why you're in this class and what you can get out of it. So, moving then to more general introductory material, we need to talk about some of the basic concepts. And so the next probably half hour or so of slides are going to be essentially defining basic concepts in the area of aging, the study of aging. And we will end by talking about different experimental designs or research designs that allow us to study aging. So this class on aging and my training in the area of aging broadly falls into what's known as developmental psychology. When most people think of developmental psychology, they tend to think of child and adolescent development. But in fact, developmental psychology as a topic area includes the study of human development from birth through the end of life. And the focus of developmental psychology is on time based changes that occur as we age. So, if we think of child development, we might look at the development of language abilities and the development of, say, being able to write. Uh, but if we think about development in older age, we might be looking at issues of how memory changes, and how our ability to recall information declines somewhat as we age. So these are essentially known as age-related changes. And that is the focus of developmental psychology, whether it's looking at young people or adulthood and focusing perhaps on older people, we look at age-related change. So the subfields of developmental psychology include kind of two broad categories: child and adolescent development, which includes infancy, childhood, and adolescence. And so this basically goes from birth to around, let's say, 18. The boundaries, by the way, tend to be somewhat fuzzy. Adult development essentially picks up where adolescent development ends. And so that's what we would call adulthood. And adulthood essentially goes from, say, age 18 through the end of life. I'm going to refer to four different categories of adulthood or age ranges of adulthood. So young adulthood is ages 18 to roughly 39. Middle age is roughly age 40 to age 64. By the way, I'm very happy to say that I am still middle aged. And so are most of my close friends, but we're getting up kind of close to that young old age category, ages 65 to just under 80, 79. And finally, we talk about old age, ages 80 plus. So when we think about old age, we break out two categories typically: young old age, which really used to be the primary focus of aging research, and then old age, which has gained a lot of traction in recent years, again, because we're seeing this extension to the lifespan. By the way, I don't think I've said this before, so I want to say this at this moment. Our class is going to focus primarily on older age, so ages 65 through the end of life. We will talk about young and middle age as well, but much of the focus, I should say, is going to be on older ages. So, what do developmental psychologists study? Essentially, what I said was age-related change. That is, if you look at an individual, how that person changes as they age. Consider the following example. Consider what it's like to take a bath. As a toddler or a child, it was probably an enjoyable experience where you played with toys, splashed around, kind of threw yourself around in the tub. You weren't worried about hurting yourself. As a young adult, you easily take a bath. And so you don't think twice about the logistics of taking that bath. You just do it. But let's think about an 80-year-old, somebody who may have some arthritis, their joints are a little stiff and sore, their muscle mass is not quite what it used to be. They still may be in pretty good health, but they're 80. That simple task of taking a bath now requires some planning. People have to think about it. And so they have to think, how do I get into the tub? Um, and not that it takes a lot of thinking, but they need to consider, how am I going to do it? Am I going to lift one leg? How do I lower myself into the tub? These are things that you probably don't have to think about at this stage in your life. So, age related change, how our functioning in various aspects of our lives changes as we age. There are two aspects of change. Intra-individual change essentially is what I just described. It's changes that occur as we age as individuals, um, and how the functioning of a particular process changes. So, for example, memory. Your memories are probably pretty good now. You probably don't have a lot of worries or concerns. As you age, your concern about your memory is likely to increase, and your performance may drop off somewhat. So that would be an intra-individual change. Another thing that psychologists and other people who study aging are focused on is known as inter-individual differences in intra-individual change. So essentially, individual differences in the way that people age. Some people age better than others. Consider this. Let's take two 80-year-olds. One 80-year-old is very close to the end of his life. Um, he is frail, has difficulty getting around, may have cognitive impairments, may essentially be on his deathbed. Perhaps another individual, let's say her life, she's also 80, but she is in much, much better shape. She is exercises daily, engaged in all sorts of activities, sees her grandparent or grandchildren. So a picture of two 80-year-olds where the functioning level is very, very different. So imagine that we could group people together, people who are doing better versus people who are not doing as well. And then we could ask the question, what differentiates these groups? And that would be individual differences in intra-individual change, or as I said before, inter-individual differences in inter-individual change. So essentially studying the factors that predict better or worse patterns of aging. Turning to kind of a way of how should we think about aging? I'm going to provide two worldviews, if you will, two ways of thinking about aging. One is a bit of a straw man. Straw man is a logical fallacy in terms of logic. Essentially, what I'm going to do is prop up the straw man, knock it down, and then give you a better way of thinking about development. But I do think it's worth talking about the traditional view before we think about a much more um, updated way of thinking about development. So in 1960, Handler defined aging as the deterioration of a mature organism resulting from dependent, essentially irreversible changes intrinsic to all members of a species, such that with the passage of time, they become increasingly unable to cope with the stress of the environment, therefore, or thereby increasing the probability of death and eventually die. So think about this statement. Read it again. Think about it. And think about just how negative it is. It essentially says that once we reach maturity, which, by the way, is around age 25 to 30, it's considered that humans really kind of reach maturity in their mid 20s up to around age 30. That once that is reached, a process of deterioration sets in and declines start to occur. That deterioration ultimately results to losses of abilities, losses of processes that a person could engage in, poorer memory, maybe loss of vision, all sorts of changes. And eventually, a person dies. So that's Handler's definition in a nutshell. Is this not true? Well, it certainly captures part of the human experience. That is, we do reach maturity. We do experience deterioration. We do eventually die. Those things are facts, and they're really not disputable. So in that sense, Handler's view is accurate. But you could argue that it doesn't fully capture the human experience of aging. That is, as individuals, as we age, we don't just focus on the deterioration. It's not all about decline. We are perfectly capable as middle-aged, older adults of having extraordinary experiences, of enjoying life, of accomplishing great things. So Handler's view is really kind of limited and does not fully capture the human experience of aging. So as an alternative way of thinking about aging, Paul Baltes in 1980, and his wife, by the way, Margaret Baltes, both of who are seminal figures in the study of aging. They're both psychologists, that both have passed away approximately 10 years ago. And they both were German descent, worked at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Paul essentially developed what he called the lifespan developmental approach to studying human development. And his definition is that the lifespan developmental approach is an orientation of study concerned with the description, explanation, and modification of developmental processes in the human life course from conception to death. So think about this definition and how it differs from the definition of handler. You might note that it's not as negative. In fact, you might note that it doesn't actually define aging. Rather, it defines the study of aging. So the lifespan developmental view essentially seeks to do three things: describe age-related change in various processes, explain why those changes occur, and then provide modifications that can help people reduce decline. So let's take an example. We know that memory performance declines. So we could describe the changes. If we study memory, we could see that a person's ability to remember words and passages declines with age. That would be a description. We could describe the decline. But that's not all that satisfying, right? Because we're not actually figuring out why the change occurs. So the next goal of the lifespan developmental view is to explain why the changes are occurring. And so to do that, we may need to look closely at the brain. And if we did that, we'd probably see that an older adult starts to experience neuronal death. Neurons and other brain cells start to die off. Neuronal transmission slows down. The speed that an action potential of a neuron is conducted slows down. We could see at a chemical level that certain neurotransmitters are not being either produced or utilized as well. All of these would provide an explanation for the observation that our memories are getting worse as we age. A third, more lofty goal is to modify the processes for good, for the better. So if we think about memory performance, you may have heard about brain training and other techniques that can be used to enhance a person's functioning and perhaps provide what's called neuroplasticity, the development of new connections and maybe even the birthing of new neurons that can help people reduce their cognitive decline. So that would be an example of modification. And so just to summarize then, the lifespan developmental approach seeks to describe the changes that occur, explain why those changes occur, and provide modifications that help people age better. There are three assumptions to the lifespan developmental view. The first is that development is a lifelong process. It doesn't end at maturity. Remember, I talked about Handler's definition of aging, that maturity in our mid to late 20s. After we reach maturity, development stops and we start to see declines. But the lifespan developmental view takes the approach that life development occurs throughout the life. Think about our knowledge base. You're learning information as a student. When you become an older adult, you can do the same thing. You can continue to grow your knowledge base. And so that is a form of development. It's not something that ends when you reach maturity. It is something that can continue as you progress through life. The second assumption is that development is a process of adaptation. Consider your life up to now. You have had to make adaptations. You've had to adjust to new environments. Going to school, going to high school. Now you're in college and you're having to adjust to a different environment. As you gain employment, develop a relationship or relationships, as you engage in perhaps marriage or not, maybe you have children, all of these require huge adaptations. As we move into the older ages, we also have to adapt. We have to adapt perhaps if we retire to a new environment where we're not working 40 hours a week. We need to fill that time in a meaningful way. We may need to adapt to physical declines, chronic diseases, and perhaps some losses as we age. So development is a process of adaptation. And the third assumption is that development is multi-directional. It includes gains, losses, and continuities. So as we go through life, we at any point we may experience gains, we may experience losses, or things may just kind of continue to go on. So depending on the different processes, psychological processes that we're talking about, we may see losses. Memory, we may see some loss. Knowledge, we may see gains. In terms of other areas, we may just kind of cruise along and see continuity. Now that we've talked about ways of thinking about aging, let's talk about aging in 3 different domains. There may actually be many domains in which we age, but there are 3 that have garnered considerable research and considerable interest. So the first domain is the physical domain, and this involves our physiology, and this is the primary mover of change. So once we reach maturity, declines can be observed in different organ systems. For example, we start to show coronary aging, and that aging can actually occur fairly early in the lifespan. So the physical domain is probably the prominent domain when we think about aging. Psychologically, number 2, we see that psychological processes like cognitive functioning, mental health, personality change with age. But here, rather than seeing declines, we tend to see gains in some areas, losses than others, and continuities. So in the psychological realm, aging is much more variable. Even more variable than that is aging in the social realm. Um, looking at social roles throughout the lifespan, they change. A young person, school is often one of the social roles that people engage in. College, um, strong relationships with friends, meeting a partner and developing that relationship, perhaps getting married, perhaps having children, and so forth. So, in the social domain, our social roles tend to change throughout the lifespan. One thing to note here is that social roles have become less restrictive than they used to be. So no longer is it sort of expected that young people are going to um, follow a certain trajectory, such as marriage, having children, their children having children, so having grandchildren, and so forth. Roles and expectations have opened up, especially in the last couple of decades. And so people are much more able to do the things that they want to do the way that they want to do them. And so we'll talk more about this in other lectures. Um, so aging occurs in three domains. And as it turns out, there are certain benchmarks that really indicate that a person is moving into older age. Of course, the strongest benchmarks are in the physical realm. And so those benchmarks, and by benchmarks, I mean something that happens to almost everybody at around the same age. And so perhaps the most notable of the physical benchmarks is loss of reproductive ability in women and in some men. And this menopause, perimenopause, and menopause occurs usually in middle age. Um, Another change that takes place that is quite predictable is that our senses dull. Our vision starts to experience aging. For example, almost all middle-aged adults start to develop what's known as presbyopia, which is the loss of the ability to see small things up close, such as small type that you're trying to read from a text. And so presbyopia is one of the aspects or ways that our senses dull. Our hearing also experiences aging. This is a topic that we'll pick up in two chapters when we talk about physiological aging. Our breath becomes short. So both the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system experience aging. And so the oxygen, our ability to transfer oxygen to the blood, decreases as we grow older, even for people who are very physically active and striving for physical fitness. A person's breath, their ability to take in oxygen decreases somewhat with age. Another thing that happens is our reflexes slow. And that is roughly by about 50% by the mid 60s. So let's say a younger person sees a light turn red while they're driving, and they can respond to hit the brake in, say, 1 second. It's going to take an older adult about a second and a half to do that same operation. So our reflexes slow. And then finally, our strength and balance declines. In terms of strength, muscle mass is reduced considerably in older age by as much as 50%. And our vestibular system, that is the system that gives us a sense of balance, along with changes in vision and other and muscle strength, skeletal intactness, if you will. All of these change, and this results in a greater susceptibility to falls. In terms of psychological benchmarks, they're less predictable. There are some. Most older adults show poorer memory. And so we'll talk about that when we talk about cognitive aging. Almost all older adults demonstrate cognitive slowing. So I said that reflexes slow. Our ability to think also slows down. And again, that's about 1.5 times slower. So we'll talk about this when we talk about cognitive aging. There is the realization that occurs as we grow older that we are aging and that our life span is shortening. And there tends to be a realization that, death is becoming more imminent. And so this realization results in changes in terms of motivation. And so at another point in the class, we'll talk about something called the socio-emotional selectivity theory. It's essentially the idea that as we realize that our time horizon is becoming shorter, we start to change what we want to do with our time. So we'll talk about that. On the good side, a psychological benchmark is that our knowledge base, assuming we're engaged, can increase. So we're able to gain knowledge, we're able to learn more important things about the world, and this is not necessarily limited by age. Finally, there's the question of wisdom, and we'll take that up at a later point. Wisdom is it's sort of questionable, and part of that depends on how you define wisdom. So there's a Western conception of wisdom, and then there's an Eastern conception of wisdom. And the two are thought of differently in terms of aging. So we'll pick that up at a later point. In terms of social benchmarks, typically there are things like marriage, parenthood, grandparenthood, retirement, losses of loved ones and friends, and perhaps loss of independence. These are not benchmarks in the same way that they're necessarily going to happen to everybody. And like I said, nowadays we have much more choice as to whether we choose to get married or even engage in a long-term relationship, whether we choose to have children, etc. So there is a lot of variability these days in the way that people live their lives, and there's a lot more acceptance of alternative lifestyles. So we've talked about some benchmarks of growing older, but note that many aspects of life are simply not on this list. And also, there's large individual differences. Some people do aging better than others. Um, one thing I want to note is that as we age, the differences among people become greater. That is, there's greater variability among individuals in older age than there is at a younger age. So, for example, most students in this class are young, healthy, um, typically free of chronic diseases. With respect to physical health, there's not a lot of variability. Imagine that we add 60 years to everybody in the class. At that point, some people have already died. Some people are not doing well. They're frail, perhaps have chronic diseases, and uh, expect to live not very much longer. But still others are going to be doing very well, active, engaged, um, physically fit, uh, basically doing it as well as it can be done. So my point is that if we look at variability among individuals and we look at things like physical fitness or even cognitive measures, we're going to see that the variability among individuals is much greater among older adults than it is in younger adults. So, a question that often comes up is, what is normative aging? You'll hear me in this class from time to time talking about the mean or the average. and uh, so the question arises, how important is that average? How meaningful is it? And in many ways, I would argue that normative aging, what the average person does, is not particularly informative because we are individuals, we take different trajectories. And so, how do we talk about the normative or average experience? Um, Most people don't have normative average experiences. And so I think it's important to think about normative aging, but I think if we look at recent history in the research domains of aging, we see that the norm, the average, has become much less important. Another way of thinking about aging is known as exceptional, or sometimes referred to as successful aging. And this is essentially comparing or looking at people who are having a lot of success as they grow older. They're likely to have high levels of physical fitness. They're likely to have few chronic diseases, and they're doing better than most people. And so it is certainly valuable to look at those people and see what is different about them compared to people who are less successfully aging. And so successful or exceptional aging, I think, is an important topic. It's also become somewhat controversial because we don't want to put people in boxes where if they're not aging all that well, there's sort of condemnation that they haven't done things right. And one argument for that, for not judging people based on how well they're aging, is the notion that genetics plays a very powerful role in the aging process, and there is great variability among individuals in terms of the genetic markers that they have, and this has a strong effect on people's lives. Another thing to think about, especially in today's world, is the idea that some people are truly advantaged and other people are at a disadvantage based on the way that they've been, the environment that they've been raised in. And so this brings up social justice issues. And it's, we want to look at across race, across um, uh, groups of various kinds, and we certainly want to be cautious about judging one group against another group. So, before we move on to talk about the issue of measuring a person's age, think about this. How do we best assess a person's age? So the question is, how do we best assess a person's age? Is age, a person's actual age, is that a good estimate of where they are likely to be at? Consider this. I just said that variability among individuals increases considerably as we age. So it could be that a person's chronological age isn't a very good indicator of where they are in terms of their lifespan. So, in fact, people who study aging have come up with a variety of different ways of thinking about age. And of course, as I mentioned, the classic way of thinking about age is chronological age, which is the time elapsed since birth. But as I've said, we could have two individuals, both age 80, and two could be in very, very different states of functioning. One very close to the end of their life, and another person who's going to live another 10, even 20 years. So chronological age turns out to be not a very good way of assessing a person's state, if you will. A much better way of assessing where a person is in terms of their lifespan is known as biological age. And biological age essentially is a adjusted measure of a person's age based on their current biological functioning. And so biological age is measured through what are known as biomarkers or bioindicators. These are measures of a person's physiology that allow for an assessment of where that person is compared to other similarly aged people. And so biomarkers include things like percent of body fat, blood pressure, where high blood pressure is a negative thing. I'll talk quite a bit at different points in this class about the APOE4 allele and how that is predictive of cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. Other biomarkers that are important include C-reactive protein, which is a measure of um, a person's sort of average inflammation level. Turns out that inflammation is a bad thing and it predicts certain kinds of heart disease and other problems. Also, stress indicators such as cortisol levels are also predictive of a person's biological status. So, biological age is probably a better way of assessing where a person is at and how much longer they're likely to live. There are also indicators of psychological age and social age. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those. Another indicator of age that is, I think, important is known as functional age. This essentially is an assessment of where a person is at in terms of their ability to live independently. And there are two measures of functional age. There is ADLs, which are activities of daily living. By the way, if you're in, say, nursing or have connections to the medical fields out there, you perhaps have heard of ADLs. Classic ADLs include measures of a person's ability to do very low level tasks, such as feeding oneself, and by this I don't mean preparing a meal, I mean literally being able to, gather food on a plate and put it in their mouth and chew it. The ability to toilet oneself independently, the ability to take care of hygiene, things like this, very low level, basic functions that we perform in our daily lives. At a higher level, another measure of functional age is instrumental activities of daily living, or what are known as IADLs. These are somewhat higher levels of function. For example, preparing a meal. So, not a measure of whether a person can feed themselves, but can they prepare their own meal, which might consist of, preparing a full meal or simply taking a frozen dinner and out and putting it in the microwave. But the question is, can the person reasonably feed themselves? Can they pay their bills would be another one. Are they able to maintain the space that they live in and so forth? So the two measures of functional age, activities of daily living, and instrumental activities of daily living, these turn out to be very important in terms of a person's ability to live an independent life. Finally, we can take these different measures of age and combine them into what's known as an age profile, where we might see the person is age 80, but their health is very good. So we're going to say their biological age is 70. Their functional age is also very good. So we're going to say that's 72. Their psychological age, maybe they've got some cognitive impairment. So we're going to say that's 83 or something like that. And so you could see how you create a profile of a person's age based on different measures of functioning. So The last topic before we talk about uh, conducting research on aging is a concept that was introduced by Bernice Newgarden in 1970. And she observed and gathered data and showed that we are gradually moving away from a society where age is extremely important as an indicator of where a person is, towards what she would call an age irrelevant society. The idea that age becomes less important as a factor in assessing where a person is at. And this has been studied in a variety of ways. So, for example, surveys have been given that ask the question, when is it appropriate? And this sounds pretty old fashioned because it dates back to research done 40, 50 years ago. Asks the question, when should a woman get married? And back in the 1960s, the predominant answer was actually between 18 and 22. That was the choice that most people selected. If you go to the 1990s and you ask the same question, the mode answer was, I think, something like between 25 and 35. So it shifted to an older age and became a much wider gap. And I suspect if we dared to ask that question today, people would just basically say, whenever I want to get married. And so the point is that age is becoming less relevant to social roles. I think we also see greater age irrelevancy in terms of physiological functioning, where people are able to do strenuous activities such as hiking, mountain climbing, into much later years than they used to. Again, age irrelevancy. And I think some of the drivers of this trend have also been the AARP, which I mentioned before, the American Association of Retired Persons. The media, which often portrays older adults in a very positive light, and the aging of the baby boomers, who are very much they're refusing to go easily. They want to maintain as functional a life as possible, and so they're trending towards this idea of age irrelevancy. And I suspect that generation by generation, we're going to see age become less relevant. So the final topic that I want to talk about in the introductory material that we're talking about today is developmental research designs. Remember I said that developmental psychology focuses on looking at and examining age change. And so the change that individuals experience as they develop in the younger years and as they age in older years. So how do we go about scientifically studying individual change? And so there have been two basic strategies to do this. The first kind of study is known as a cross-sectional study, and the second is known as a longitudinal study. So I'm going to talk about both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies and how they differ in their ways of assessing changes that are associated with aging. And one of these two is considerably better in actually measuring a person's change. So we'll talk about that. So let's first talk about cross-sectional studies. In a cross-sectional study, people from different ages are tested at the same time on a measure of performance. So for example, we might compare 100 younger adults and 100 older adults on their political views. And if you were to create a hypothesis about what you think would the age difference would be, you might predict that older adults are going to be more conservative than younger adults. And that seems like a pretty good prediction. Let's think of another example. Memory performance in young and older adults, where again we test a bunch of younger adults and we test a bunch of older adults and we compare their performance with the prediction that the older adults are going to have poorer memories compared to the younger adults. So that would be two different examples of a cross-sectional design. So cross-sectional studies actually account for somewhere between 70 and 80% of all research studies that are published in both the developmental and aging research domains. So they're by far the most popular form of study. And that is because they are easy to do compared to longitudinal research. They're economical and efficient. What do I mean? So the budget, perhaps I've worked on grant-funded studies, and one of those grants funded research on memory and aging. It was a 5-year grant, and I believe the budget was in the range of $300,000 for 5 years. Sounds like a lot of money. I also worked for a longitudinal study known as the Long Beach Longitudinal Study. It also received a grant for 5 years. The amount of money for that grant was $3.5 million. That is a lot more money. So cross-sectional studies are economical. They're inexpensive. They also can be done in what may sound like a long period of time, but in research time is actually pretty efficient. And that is, you can do a cross-sectional study in perhaps 6 months to a year. From inception to reporting the results and submitting for publication, likely somewhere between 6 months and a year. That sounds like a long time, but compared to longitudinal studies, that is very, very short period of time. Unfortunately, cross-sectional studies are not actually a very good way of studying age change. In fact, they don't study age change. They do not measure change within individuals. What they measure is age differences. So when we're comparing the younger and the older adults on memory performance, and we conclude that the older adults performed more poorly than the younger adults, We're essentially trying to say that age changed memory performance as they aged. But that's not what the data is. The data is an age difference, not an age change. So when we run cross-sectional studies, we're not actually looking at individual change, which is our goal. We're looking at age group differences. Secondly, the goal is to measure age change, if you will, but that measure is confounded with what are known as birth cohort effects. So let's think about our memory study. We have two groups. We have younger adults and we have older adults. The younger adults, let's say they're in their 20s, and the older adults are in their 70s. So the older adults are older. They're on average, let's say 50 years older. So that's quite a bit older. And of course, that's what we want to say. Their performance is worse because they've aged. But they're also born to a different cohort. So they're born at a different time in a different world, if you will, that is likely to not have the benefits that perhaps you were born into. And this is known as cohort effects. So we know that older adults are born into a earlier born cohort, and that negatively affects them because their education was not as good. I know that may be hard to believe, but it is true. Education has gotten better over generations. Their health and their exposure to healthcare is less compared to people born more recently. And also their understanding of technology and their ability to use tech is also considerably less, not based on their age, but based on when they were born. So in a cross-sectional study, age and cohort are confounded. You cannot separate a person's age from when they were born. And this causes problems for drawing conclusions. In a developmental study, we want to say that age caused the changes or the differences, but we cannot rule out the possibility that there were cohort differences. And so this is it's a very severe flaw in the experimental design of cross-sectional studies. This, by the way, means that most cross-sectional studies, especially that look at performance-based measures, are biased against older adults compared to younger adults. And that is because the older adults are essentially doubly damned. They're damned because they're older, but they're also damned because they haven't had the same quality of educational experience, they haven't had the same technology exposure, and they haven't had the same health exposures. So essentially, this means that oftentimes our conclusions that we draw from a cross-sectional study are overly negative in terms of age-related differences. The second design that we use in studying development is known as a longitudinal design or a longitudinal study. And I think I've mentioned before that I've been involved in a longitudinal study known as the Long Beach Longitudinal Study. In studies like that, individuals are tested on 2 or more occasions to track age-related changes within individuals. So you might begin with a group of people. Maybe they're somewhat differently aged when they're initially tested. So let's say we take a group of people who are in their 30s when we first test them. And then we retest them with roughly the same measures every 5 years for the rest of their life. That means that we can look within an individual to track or plot the age-related change that they experience. So in a longitudinal design, we are measuring age change. And that is a real advantage compared to cross-sectional studies. So like I said, we might be testing 100 adults ages 30 to 39 at the first testing, and then we test them on their memory performance every 5 years after that, with the goal of doing that actually until they die. That means that you're conducting the same study for 40, 50 years, and that is also an issue. So the advantages of longitudinal studies is that they directly examine age change. And this is considered the gold standard of developmental studies. They can be used to chart individual development. And if you have a large group of individuals and you chart each person's development, then you can try and figure out why some people are showing less change or smaller declines than other people. So that allows you to look at individual differences, which I referred to earlier. So longitudinal studies are, at this point, superior in their ability to assess the measure that we are most desired, that is age change. But there are several disadvantages that make them not very desirable in some ways and rare in terms of the literature. So like I alluded to before, they are expensive. I mentioned that the budget for the Long Beach study was $3.5 million over 5 years. Other studies have larger budgets. There's a study known as the Health and Retirement Study. And every year that study receives multiple millions of dollars to run that study. So they are expensive. They're also time consuming. So imagine this. If you're doing a longitudinal study and it requires 5 years between testings, you're not going to have your second testing for 5 years. And your third testing will be 10 years down the road. And your fourth testing will be 15 years down the road. From a analysis standpoint, you really need to have, at the very minimum, 3 test occasions. So it's not until 10 years that the study is likely to produce the kinds of results that people are seeking. So they're very, very time consuming. Another thing is that for the people who develop the study, often referred to as the primary investigator, the PI, those people essentially make a life commitment to doing that study. They can't change. They're going to do the same basic research for decades. And not that many people want to make that kind of commitment. Another disadvantage is that age does have a confound in a longitudinal study, and that is known as period or historical effects. So let's imagine, for example, that we are studying depression. And we're doing it longitudinally, and we began our study before COVID-19, and we're about to do our second measurement, and now COVID is kicked in. That's going to mean a huge historical change that is likely to negatively affect our measures of depression. You could imagine that. So historical changes can cause problems. Although for most longitudinal study, period effects or historical changes are usually pretty small and don't constitute a major problem. Another disadvantage to longitudinal studies, by the way, the list is long, is practice effects. Practice effects is essentially the idea that following the baseline testing, people are likely to do better because they're taking the same tests a second time. Even if that's 3, 5, 10 years later, they're likely to get a little bit better because they've taken the test before. They may remember stimuli, they may remember the procedure, or maybe even they're just more relaxed, but they're likely to do better. So practice effects mean that you're likely to see improvement from your first testing, the baseline testing, to the second testing. And in fact, that is not what we would predict based on age. We would predict that age-related declines would cause poorer performance. So practice effects present a problem, but there are a couple of things that have been observed that make them understandable and that they can be controlled statistically. The first observation is that the practice effect is likely to occur between the first and second test occasion and then stabilize. Practice effects don't increase after the second testing. So that allows statistical control to be applied. The final disadvantage to longitudinal studies is known as attrition. And this is the problem that's associated with dropout. You can imagine that if you're testing the same group of people every 3 or 5 years, that people are not going to show up. They might get tired of the testing. They don't want to do 8 hours of testing, which, by the way, is how much the time requirement for the Long Beach studies is about 8 hours of testing. They may move, and so the study loses track of where the people are. Again, that causes missing data. More importantly, people may refuse to continue in the study because they're either in bad health or they have developed some kind of cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's. When that happens, that is a serious problem because you are not getting the data from the people who are likely to perform the worst. You're only getting data from the people who remain in the study who tend to be doing better. So this creates a bias where it tends to mean that we underestimate age-related declines because the people who would show the real age declines aren't being tested. They're dropping out. The good news in the area of attrition is that in the last 25 years, statistical methods have been developed to essentially model the participants' missing data. And you might say, isn't that faking your data? And the answer is sort of, but you're doing it based on information you have that differentiates those people from people who stay in the study. And so modern statistical modeling techniques have allowed researchers to overcome this positive bias. So at this point, longitudinal studies are the gold standard. They are better than cross-sectional studies in terms of measuring age change. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about cohort. I talked about or referred to birth cohort. So let's talk about cohort. In aging research, the term cohort, also known as birth cohort, is defined as a group of people born at about the same time. So this is broadly defined by the researcher. So it could be everybody born in a certain year, 1939. Or it could be people born during a certain decade, between 1940 and 1949. Or we could think about cohort in terms of generations. You have certainly heard of the baby boom generation. That would be people born between about 1944 and 1963. Turns out I am a tail end baby boomer. I was born in the early 60s. Generation X is almost kind of a lost generation, but they were born between roughly 1964 and 83. The millennial generation was born roughly between about 1984, 5 and 2000. Somewhere the numbers start to get a little fuzzy. And so the millennials are in their primarily in their 30s these days. Many of you are either millennials or you're Gen Z, Generation Z, which means that you were born in the late 80s, 90s, and you represent a new generation that at this point is sort of being defined, and will be differentiated eventually from the millennials. So we tend to think of, beginning with after this World War II period, we've thought about generations, and often group people into generational cohorts. By the way, this we talk like a millennial is going to fit these characteristics, and a baby boomer is going to be a different person, and that these groups are fairly homogeneous. That is certainly not true. The individual differences between millennials are probably much greater than the differences between millennials and baby boomers. So I think an awful lot has been made of these generational differences that may not be all that important. To finish out, I just want to talk briefly about a cohort related effect known as the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is an observation made by a guy, New Zealand researcher, a researcher from New Zealand, who has observed that generation by generation, we are getting smarter. If you measure intelligence by measures of what are known inductive reasoning. So this generational trend has developed where each new generation, each successive generation has performed better on measures of inductive reasoning than previous generations. The reasons for this are not fully explained, but do include some of the things I mentioned earlier. Generation by generation, our education is getting better. Our health and our access to good health care has gotten better, and our access to technology has grown. So the Flynn effect is at least partially explained by these observations. Whether the Flynn effect will continue and your children will effectively be smarter than you, just like you people are smarter than my generation, remains to be seen. But it has been observed. It has been observed not just in developed nations, but also in developing nations and across the globe. So the Flynn effect seems to be a pretty stable effect that we see everywhere throughout the world. So with that, I'm going to finish up the lecture. And so we will perform this class exercise when we meet after this lecture. And so, but I'll introduce it. Take a moment to think about an issue of interest to you that intersects with aging and answers the following questions. What question about aging do you want to answer? And secondly, what kind of study would you do? That is, how do you think you could study that issue? Propose a study that would help to answer your question. Be sure to be as specific as possible about study design. So what do I mean? I mean, do you want to study it through cross-sectional means or by doing a longitudinal study. So think about that. We will do this as a class exercise when we meet. So this essentially is the end. And what we have done today is essentially answered the question, why is aging important to study? And we've laid the groundwork for the different topics that we're going to talk about as we progress in this class. So have a good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever time it is, and I will see you on Zoom in class.